Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I have interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of songwriters about the writing process. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So I've always been interested in treating songwriters the same way that we treat poets and traditional prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. There is no talk of how bands get their name, favorite tour stories, favorite foods, band drama, or anything else. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers as we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. That's it, nothing else. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the pod, I loved this conversation. Maddie Gervais of Head in the Heart. I had on Maddie's bandmate, Jonathan Russell, in 2022, so check that out. But the latest album by The Head in the Heart is called Aperture. And this was we just went all over the place in a good way, talking about the process. When I asked him, as I always do with these interviews, if the artist likes to write every day or just when the mood strikes, he actually started talking about his first experience as a songwriter. Really went back all the way to when he first started writing as a kid. And I've never gotten that answer before, but I loved hearing about what his process was like early on when he was a teenager. And it's pretty clear. I mean, I wrote this quote down. He says, without the manual labor, the channeling can't happen. So you can see where he stands on that, about how important it is to put the work in and not wait until the mood strikes, but you've got to put in the work. And he's got all those Mead notebooks to show for it, and notebook after notebook of ideas that he still has from a long time ago. And also the importance of making connections, even in the grocery store, whether it's a face or something that he sees or something someone says, being open and being receptive to hearing anything. He has experience also in the visual art field. So we did talk a lot about that too. He used to work at art galleries in Seattle where he lives, and we discuss the impact and the influence that art galleries, I mean, he worked in one, not just would go to visit them. He worked in one, and the big influence that visual art has on his process. We talked about books. I just have a long list of things we talked about here. We went all over the place, but I hope you can tell I loved this conversation. We talked for an hour. We probably could have talked for a couple more, just because he had so much to say. And he was such an enthusiastic participant here. So I love that. Maddie, if you're listening, thank you. Anyway, the latest album by The Head in the Heart is called Aperture. And here is my interview with Maddie Gervais. As an artist, as a writer, is it important to create in some fashion every day?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you're starting out. I, I guess I think back to, like my early days. This just makes me think back to my early days when I was just getting into music and I was just so propelled to do it. Um, and, would had an older brother, so I had like someone who kind of held my hand into the process, and through a community of friends, got into recording myself on a 4-track, and was able to turn that into something that was kind of very self-sustaining. Like it didn't require anybody else to be a part of the process, and so I would just like dig in and like when everyone else was getting home from school and going and off and playing sports with their friends or whatever, I was going into the basement and writing and recording songs, you know what I mean? And like, it was pretty much an almost daily thing. My mom and my parents could attest to. Um, and so I, through the process of, especially early on, and we're talking like starting from like 12, all the way through high school, like was making like this gigantic catalog of songs, and like on 4 track. So playing drums and bass and guitar and vocals and overdubbing things and ping ponging tracks and all this kind of stuff to come up with just to flex the muscle and figure it out. And many of my songs had zero meaning whatsoever to start. Like the lyrically, I was like, what do you have to write about when you're 12, right? And so I'd be reading like, my brother was started me off on being like a big fan of Bad Religion, uh, and so and Greg Graffin's lyrics are so talk about PhD. I mean, they're PhD level SAT words, just strewn about in these songs that are, politically charged, deep. For a 12-year-old who's loving that and loving the energy of the punk rock music that was couching those lyrics, uh, it was like completely way over my head. You know what I mean? But also at the same time, having this older brother, he would write down the vocabulary words that Greg Graffin had written, and translate the definitions. And I remember like getting down in the basement and seeing these like SAT words basically, but they're Bad Religion SAT words. And then I would just like sing them over the top of my like instrumentals that I wrote. And so and it would be like the word and the definition, and the song was absolutely meaningless. You know what I mean? Or like, or a song that like, was about ketchup and, hungry for tomatoes, just absolute nonsense stuff. But slowly but surely, like, through the process of like getting more comfortable with it and realizing there wasn't really anybody listening to it, at that time, like I could start putting my own, uh, you know, I started to feel like, oh, this is my out. This is my way of like talking about like the girl that I like in school, or the person who scorned me today, or whatever the feeling might be, or the thing that I was going through at the time, and diary entrying like into this thing, which eventually became a way of processing grief and all the different things and that I was going through as a human and progressing into adulthood. So, so to answer the questions, like, yes, like so much of it was just showing up and because of that, like, inspiration would strike. I remember hearing so many people talking about like, "Oh, I wish I could do what you do because, but I just don't have I don't have the inspiration." It's like, well, I never started out with inspiration either. I would like, just be compelled to go down and work on something, even if there was nothing in the tank necessarily, and just and it's the repetition and the showing up that would deliver things. And that just became so second nature that now as an adult, like when I go into the studio, I understand that, and I'm not worried that like nothing's going to come, because I just know how the process works, and I'm okay if there's only just a little snippet here or there, and what I mean. And hypothetically, gradually things become more meaningful and more concise, and all of the things you hope for as an artist that's progressing.
So even today, like if you're not in the studio, you're still in some fashion, you're writing every day, even if it's little snippets.
Um, so I would say, like, so the way that it picks up for me, especially when it becomes your profession, is like you go through these periods of like, okay, now we're in the business of like getting this record out, and so I'm not in the studio writing every single day right now, because we're having to do all these different things to promote the album, and we're learning how to perform the songs that we wrote, over the course of the last year. And so in some ways you're bringing creativity to things that you've already done the groundwork and the legwork on right now. So like, yes, I'm coming into the studio every day, but I'm not writing something new because I'm, finding my way into the songs that we've already written, or learning a cover song, or listening to songs. And it's these guys here, like every couple of years I go on a deep dive back into their catalog, and like it reinvigorates my love of music. And like, so it's not just creative output only, it's a lot of ingestion as well, that's happening. And so it's kind of like this ebb and flow of like, okay, this is my time to ingest a lot. And right now that's what I'm doing. We talked about biographies, and I'm listening to the Paul McCartney audiobook of his biography that just came out. And so like that's kind of a lot of this kind of like ingestion is super integral to like, this the next creative burst.
Yeah, so do you do, other types of writing, like journal writing, anything like that?
Yeah. In high school, I was starting to write. Was taking the poetry classes in high school and stuff like that, and writing, and then inspired by Kurt Cobain, actually, when his journals were published back in the early 2000s. Um, uh, I like it's kind of dorky, really, but like I I bought the exact kind of Mead notebooks that Kurt used, and like I started a habit of just doing exactly what he did and writing in and journaling in there every day. Like long before like I had heard of the artist's way and like that journaling kind of practice that artist's way very fruitfully sets up for people. And I've tried that. I've done that as well. In after a period of being kind of blocked. Um, but yeah, it's always been built up. So I've actually in my studio here, I've got this just like it's dorky, like I said, but this my own version of Kurt's journals, on the Mead notebooks that it's become like I have my own like encyclopedia of them that goes way back 20 plus years. And that's been really cool because it's like as a my dad was an art teacher, and every time I would like have a nice fancy piece of paper, I would never make a piece of art on it because it was like, oh, this is too good for me. But a Mead notebook, I can scribble whatever the hell I want in there, and I don't feel like I have to be perfect or precise or it has to be good. You know what I mean? And therefore, there's just like I'm getting all of my garbage out in that. It's funny to think actually because that's so much of what the artist way is teaching you when you go through the artist way process. And it's funny, I hadn't even really realized like, oh, I was doing that already before I had ever heard of artist way.
How often do you go back to those journals?
um, so like not very often, to be honest with you. If I'm in the process of filling one out, um, I might go back and look at stuff and like, especially if I'm like, oh, I'm sensing that I've got like a body of work going on. Like, I will pour over that notebook and go back and forth within it. But like, the ones that I've got from 20 years ago, it's almost painful to go back and look at it just because it's like bringing up all these different periods of life you haven't thought of in a long time, which can be fun, but it can also be painful. You know what I mean? And, but they are time capsules. Phones have made it actually more difficult. It's not as visceral or something. And so I need to remind myself to get back to the notebook.
You don't think that going back to those notebooks would be a good source of kind of mining for ideas or inspiration?
I don't have any designs on doing that, at least at this point in my life. I would feel like I need to have accomplished a little bit more before I felt like it was a worthy endeavor. But, but, uh, but like having that stuff there, it definitely spurs things and jogs things. And in tandem with that, like as a musician, I've got these, voice memos of ideas that are melodic ideas, but they're not anything concrete. And so you simultaneously living with uh this notepad filled with stuff and also a voice memo on your phone. And before that it was like this little voice recorder thing I had that like it just slowly but surely like accumulates over time. And in the ideal, when you're really firing on all four cylinders, you're seeing where all the connections are coming from. And it's almost like you're not writing this stuff, it's right itself, and your job is just to assemble it and be diligent about listening for it and presenting, and making those connections and paying attention, you know even when you're at the grocery store for like, oh, that that little thing that I just saw, that interaction between those two people perfectly describes this next line that I needed to write in this song. Like, and just like it's kind of staying observant.
Another follow-up.
I'm scatterbraining it right now. I'm like,
No, not at
shoot.
all. I'm furiously trying to keep up with all these things I want to ask you because it's funny. I interviewed Britt Daniel from Spoon. This is like 5 years ago, and he said that
Cool.
he will sit at a bar with his laptop and listen to conversations and and when someone says something he'll type that in, and that might be a song lyric later on. And I thought, wow, like if you ever see Britt Daniel at a bar with his laptop,
Yeah,
be careful
careful.
what you
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's
Well,
kind of what you're saying is you're here, you're hyper aware of those things being said around you as a songwriter, right?
being said or interactions you might see, or just like, the even if it's just the look on someone's face as they're going through their day that, you're just noticing some things like that, and I'm reminded of like there's a song on this new record that um I I but I say like your face turned towards the wind, just like a wild orchid bending. And I took the and I that line came after we Charity and I visited the Asian Art Museum in Seattle, and there's all these beautiful hanging scrolls with these beautiful titles, and one of them talked about a wild orchid bending in the wind. And so I just, I was like, oh, I love that. It's just such a pretty image, and it evokes so much. And so I was like, oh, this is like this just fits within this type of this gentle presence in the face of something, some adversity. And so I was like, oh, this just, those kind of little things where you're like, oh, that's a little nugget that's just perfect for what I'm working on right now. It's like you know uh, um, a Beatles a day in the life where they're pulling things from newspaper headlines and stuff like that, and it's um, finding out like, oh, like the writing process doesn't have to be conjuring it from nowhere, and pulling it out. It doesn't have to be so painful because for years for me, it felt really like, oh, this is such a chore. It's so painful to just to conjure these ideas, bring them out, um, and in the last few years, it's been much more a gentle unfolding for me that just feels a lot more like, oh, I could sustain this. You know what I mean? Um, there's like two ways of approaching it, and one is to like beat your head against the wall, and the other is to just continuously show up for it. So,
Yeah. So how did you so how did you overcome that? Did you deliberately do things like open yourself up to, because if you recognize that it was this kind of tedious, laborious process, did you do things consciously to open yourself up and make it less tedious?
um, just before COVID, I was in that state where I was like, God, I'm just beating my head against the wall with this stuff. And so I went through and I did the artist's way, like very diligently, and did the whole program, and uh, and saw how that kind of opened back up some pathways that I had forgotten were available, or maybe didn't even know were available to me yet, um, and that was really fruitful as a way of kind of reopening something that felt like locked down for various other reasons. And so a combination of that and like with before this record came out, I was really inspired by the Rick Rubin's Creative Acts book as well, because it talked about a lot of that kind of same process oriented thinking. Um, and the thing that was the most inspiring to me was that, that it removed the onus from the writer themselves, like especially the way Rick talks about it, but it's true in the other way too. It takes the onus off of you, the individual, and the things that you're writing, and puts it on uh, a trust and an openness um, to allowing for the creativity to flow through you, rather than you know trying to conjure it out of thin air in this act of that just feels like manual labor. So it's a delicate dance, because like without the manual labor, that channeling can't happen. And so it's like what you're talking about earlier about showing up every day and the habit of it. Preparing, it's like if you're learning how to play a complex piece on the piano, you can't just like expect that to just somehow channel through you without showing up and laboring over it day after day and failing over and over and again. And that's part of the process of songwriting and getting to a place where it feels really productive and pure is like doing that labor. And so I guess maybe now that the more I talk through it with you, the more I'm realizing that maybe, this free flowing thing that I found myself in now as a result of having gone through a lot of more militant and almost self-flagellating art um you know just boot camp style writing sessions.
And Ernest Hemingway said, all writers should go to art galleries to get inspired. And since you already
uh
mentioned an art gallery,
yeah.
and I'm curious how you think, because I've heard this from songwriters too. Some of them get inspired by the actual art, seeing it. Others actually get inspired practically by the titles of the art. So I'd love to know, you touched on this briefly. I'd love to know how visual art would inspire you as a songwriter.
During my formative years in my early 20s, I worked at the Seattle Art Museum here in town, and I was an exhibition installation preparator, they call it. And so I was surrounded by art constantly. So in my head, I had music going, but in my actual practical life, I was hands on working with art, hanging art. Uh, I was a security guard there for a while before I was doing the installation. So I would just be wandering through the galleries, and observing and looking at things, and I'd have an idea or a melody in my head, and I'd be noticing the art and noticing the titles. I think the combination really and the associations created with the combination of like the artist has the decision to name it, Wild Orchid Bending in the Wind, or you know, Abstraction Number Three. Like there's the both of those things are really valid, options. And being exposed to a lot of different creative minds and the processes that they went through and how they came to, develop their own oomph. Like that is in itself like opening up. So it's not necessarily a reaction to like, oh, I saw an amazing Rembrandt and that made me write a song. It's more like I saw how Rembrandt created a way of working that worked for him. And I see how that contrasts to how Mark Rothko created a way of working that looks nothing like it, but there's still oil paint on a canvas. You know what I mean? So like the medium is exactly the same. It's just two different ways of working and that don't necessarily like within the same medium. Um, and with regard to like art specifically, it's kind of all of the above because I studied it in college as well, and like just like one of the things that sticks out to me was um like movements like the surrealist movement and Dada, and in the early 20th century, there was a lot of like art manifestos. Every art movement had a manifesto that was associated with it, and that kind of like um, parameter setting for artwork and for creativity felt really inspiring because you're seeing the artists like reacting against what's there and then creating a set of parameters within which they want to work. And that just was like such an interesting concept because it totally applies to music. You know what I mean? You can your context and your parameters might be set within the context of a single album, or it might be set within the context of an entire career or a portion at least of the career. And seeing how those movements happen over time is really inspiring. So, like, if you look at the early work of like Roy Lichtenstein, or Jackson Pollock, it's like much more studied and realistic, and he did work with the Works Progress Administration, and it's like it looks like sideboard painting, and it's it, and then it moves on into this crazy abstraction, or in the case of de Kooning, it's like these wild colors that he's known for, and then later on in life it softens up and it's more abstract, and there's these periods. And the same thing with Picasso's, like everyone's, their careers are split up into these different sort of creative bursts that last for a year or two, you know what I mean? And like seeing that and thinking about your own output in that same context is also really inspiring, because it helps to like take the take it from being some big daunting thing, like how am I going to be inspired? Where do I begin? To being like, oh, I'm going to start thinking within these little chunks and these little parameters. Uh, and work within that and see how like setting those limitations up for yourself can help you steer yourself into something that you don't have to ride for the rest of your life. If that makes sense.
It does, but it's an answer that only someone who studied art could give me, because normally, the answers are much simpler. It's, yeah, I saw this painting and the red in the painting, made me feel. But I love, they was like the red in the painting made me feel a certain emotion, so I wrote a song about that emotion. But you're thinking about it on a much more philosophical level, kind of like where is the thing I'm creating? Where does it sit in this space, right? I mean, it's a much deeper thought philosophically than merely, oh, that title of that reminds me of a song or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think of like Don McLean, and Starry Starry Night. I've never been I've never had a one-to-one transference like that. I would love to if something like that happened, but for me, it's more an assembly of a lot of seemingly disparate parts that are making connections within myself and then assembling them like a puzzle, if that makes sense.
So interesting. Yeah. Okay. So on a much more basic level, when it comes to writing, are you a pen and paper person or a computer person?
I love and prefer pen and paper, when it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty. And so I'll start my drafts in a notebook, like I mentioned. Um, and they will be scribbled on, if it's a notepad or if it's, whatever's available, I'll start there. And then and then what I'll do is I'll move that to, the notes in my phone or on my computer. And um thinking of writers, I remember kind of learning about the genesis of a lot of Leonard Cohen's writing, and noticing and hearing different versions of songs, and like his most famous song Hallelujah had like way more verses on it than are what are like the known verses, and the version that Jeff Buckley did is has different verses on it than the one that he did for his record. And like coming to the and same thing with like Dylan, like coming to the understanding and realization that like, oh, not every piece of effort you put in makes the cutting makes the final cut. And so like within a song, I think I used to be way more precious about like, oh, everything that I wrote has to be in the final version of it. And seeing that example set by people like Cohen and Dylan, being like, oh, there was like 13 other verses. Oh, but I only used these ones. That was very freeing as well, too, because then you'd start writing within a pentameter, like your Shakespeare, and but the song dictates it, and so then I'm like, okay, I'm just writing like 10 verses, and 3 or 4 are going to make it, and like that. That was really that's where the computer comes in handy, because then I'm like, I can just highlight a whole verse and drag it up and see how it connects to this verse and move it around. Um, so there's definite stages to it in drafts. And then like, oh,
Okay.
like I love that line, but it doesn't make sense, and there's nothing else that goes with it. So like I'll delete that and just leave it out there. But it'll be hanging out at the bottom of my Pages document. You know what I mean?
Okay. So this is my initial reaction, is that you had said earlier that with the journals, at least, you want to make the process less precious. And this is my I hear from songwriters all the time. There's those who write in the Moleskine journal with the fancy pen, And there are
Oh,
those
yeah.
who write lyrics on the back of utility bills. But
Yeah.
but but I mean, if I heard you correctly earlier, it was when you're writing, you don't want it to be precious because you don't want to have that pressure on you, right? So
Yes.
when you're writing lyrics, then you deliberately will make it as as least as less precious as possible.
Yeah. Which, like the modern version of it, truthfully, is like I'll be going on a walk and a line will pop into my head and I'll just write it down in my notes app. You know what I mean? That it doesn't get less precious than that because it's just like, there's an infinite amount of space I can write on it and I can move them around and cut and paste and copy and move things. And so I do a lot of that as well. Because that's very unprecious and it's always in your pocket. So it's easy. You know what I mean? So I do a lot of that writing. Like a lot of the writing for this current record was like started on the notepad or the notes app, my phone, because it's just right there ready for you. Or the voice memo. And I just sing into it, I like this line, I'm going to sing it because it's coming to me now. And if I don't do this, I'll forget it. So there's a lot of that kind of in the moment, in a walk, birds chirping in the background kind of stuff.
Okay, but Maddie, how many of those voice memos do you have, and how often do you really go back to them?
Um, yeah, not like a lot during the process of making the record. Uh, but then like right now, I haven't looked at my voice memo app in like a couple of months because I haven't been contributing to it. And I've been focusing on the like completion and learning process of like how we're going to perform the songs live. So yeah, it's I'm in that different part of the swing right now. But that being said, uh I there was a couple years ago I was really thankful and grateful that I had these voice memos because if you go back and you're just like zoom, zip, zip, scrolling back and several years, or I had one of these ones that wasn't, and it wasn't the phone. It was like a little voice memo thing that my parents got for me as a Christmas gift many years ago. And it was like a time capsule. And I plugged it into the computer and started listening to these things that were like 10, 15 years old. I was like, oh, there's some really good song ideas on here that I had forgotten complete existed. And so like that's really handy. Like if you find yourself stuck, you're like, oh, what's on this thing? There's because I remember like a Neil Young. Oh, it was when Silver and Gold, the record came out of Neil Young's, and I realized that like some of the songs were recorded in the '70s, and some were recorded in the early 2000s, and some in the '90s, and like, but the record feels cohesive, and all the songs fit within a particular feeling that makes sense, and that was like, oh, a eureka moment for me because then I realized like these songs that were written or started 15 years ago could be just as relevant today, especially when viewed through the lens of what your current self brings to the table. And there's a communication and dialogue that happens between it, and you might do like what John Lennon did with um, um, the road to Marrakesh, which started off on just a child of nature and became I didn't mean to hurt you, and was came out on his on the Imagine album. So it's like keeping things alive and realizing like they can exist in different ways and they don't have to be what they were at the onset, is really helpful and really kind of cool. So yeah, it's a good reminder. I should go dig back go back 10 years and see what's there.
I Pete Yorn on within the past 6 months, and he showed me he has a notebook that he kept from college 30 plus years ago, and he still has it, and he will go back to that notebook from 30 years ago still, and for song ideas.
Dude, so cool. That's so cool. Yeah. Yeah, I've got them
Um,
all up here.
But that's
It's
what you lose. I mean, and I think that's to me the value with the pen and paper versus computer is that I think when I see those things that I wrote, I can almost put myself in the situations a lot better because there's something about seeing the way I was writing. I don't feel that this is not me talking like an old man. I don't think, but if I look at a journal entry that I wrote on a computer, I'm not going to get the same emotional feel that I have if I see something that was on a pen and that was in a notebook.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've never once written a journal entry on a computer and never will because like there's just something so dangerous about that. Like I would never want anyone to look at them. The whole point of them is to be like I'm getting my thoughts out. I don't want somebody to be able to open up the computer and find it, you know what I mean? And so yeah, there's definitely a little bit of that for me for sure.
So I discovered this about myself actually yesterday
Yeah.
as a writer. Um, that with I was typing something and I was trying to write a sentence and I couldn't get it out. So all I did was I looked outside of the window right here for 10 seconds and I came back and I realized that simple act of looking away briefly it was it like that sentence came to me, and I thought that was so and I'm gonna use that all the time from now on, where literally it
Mhm.
was like, this thing in front of me, I'm staring at it, I can't get through it, and it didn't take that long, I just looked away and looked at the leaves of the birds outside, and I came back, and it was like, that's what I was trying to say,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna use that from now on when I that happens, so that's my quirk.
Yeah.
One of my also quirks is I never write and revise in the same place. So if I'm writing in this chair, I'll revise in that chair behind me. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah, that
do you
makes
have
sense.
any? Yeah, do you have any quirks like that?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think part of was why I thought I had to beat myself over the head for a long time was exactly what you just described. Of like, okay, I'm in the same environment. I'm staring at the same computer screen, or I'm staring at the same notepad, and it's feeling like work, and it's not fun. And then there's the realization, like, oh, I still have the same, brain in between these 2 ears that can, like, work anywhere. In fact, works better peripatetically. Like, I'm gonna I and so a big portion for me of, like, my creative, like, especially for songs because it's a particular thing, but even like, journal entry or, like, we've been doing these blurbs for our email list that are fun to write, that are a little more literary, like writing them while on a walk and composing the sentences and bouncing them around in your head before you even start to write them down on something, and so we live in West Seattle, and there's this park by our house that has some of the last remaining like old growth trees still extant from what it used to look like before all the development happened here. And there's trails that cut through this park, and it's amazing. And I go through there 3 or 4 times a week. And you talked about birds and trees and leaves and stuff like that. Uh, that is such a pure place of I'll use it 90% of the time. I'm just walking through and I'm walking meditation, and I'm trying intentionally to not think about the things that I need to think about. But what ends up happening is that like thoughts are going in and out, and and I'm kind of purifying myself in the process. But if I go into that same walk with a set of intentions, like, oh, I'm going to go, but I'm going to have this on my mind, and I'm going to be thinking about like, how can I structure this sentence, or how can I craft this line? Uh, it's a very gentle way of, like, just allowing it to happen, and then I can always jot it down, when I get home or, like, in my notes app, like I said, and that's my version of that, I suppose, that's really handy. I just, doing things while walking. It's like intention setting.
Yeah, walking is to me, I was going to say, is I find it to be very valuable, but it's got to be a walk in familiar territory because if it's an unfamiliar territory, then I'm going to be noticing my surroundings and not focusing as much on kind of like the daydreaming. So I think
Yeah.
that's what you're doing is you're walking in the same place. I'm curious if you went to a new park, if you'd have that same effect.
Yeah, that's probably true. Like a park might be similar, but like if I was navigating a city that I didn't know, you're having to chat, you're turning on a totally different part of your brain, and you're bringing that kind of like very very survival instinct mode of your brain on, whereas like when you're familiar with the turf, like you said, yeah, you're right. You're allowed to turn off that kind of like self-preservation mechanism, and you can just go into the little bit deeper brain waves. It's true. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're totally right. That makes sense.
Well, my favorite quote that I tell songwriters all the time is Agatha Christie once said the best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes. So the thought about that is that when your brain is engaged in an unconscious activity, that's when the creativity bubbles up. So I've had songwriters tell me they get ideas when they were gardening, cleaning, vacuuming, doing the dishes, like chopping vegetables, even things like that that aren't even outside. It's the fact that when you're doing something that requires no conscious thought.
Yes. 100%. Yeah, dishes is a huge one. Yeah, I didn't even mention that. Like, especially having kids, like we do dishes, like such an ungodly amount of dishes that like I I try to turn off my resentment of it and just go into the like the that mode, you know what I mean? If you just let your mind like, okay, this is meditative time for me. And like that definitely can turn something that feels like an annoying task into something that can be fruitful. It's true. Yeah. Vacuuming as
It's
well is a big one for songwriting because you turn the vacuum on and all of a sudden there's like this sound that like you can sing over the top of, and like it's freeing. I used to do that when I worked at the museum. Actually, I'd have to sand the walls with this big loud vacuum sander, and I would sing at the same time because it was like blocking out the ability to hear my voice. And so it like was weirdly freeing, and I'd be writing songs like that with this just extreme white noise happening.
Yeah, but I think it's also the motion because you're doing this and that's repetitive and
Yep.
vacuuming is repetitive
Yep.
and mowing a lawn is repetitive and painting is repetitive. So I think it has to also be a repetitive motion.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I totally that all makes sense.
Oh, okay. Two more questions. And the first is, I found that having kids would make me much more productive because Um, now our kids are our youngest is in 8th grade, but back when, if you had when you have kids, you realize your time is not your own. So the kid's down for a nap, you've got an hour to get stuff done, because you don't have a lot of time anymore. So do you find that having kids has made you more disciplined?
100%. You just described it exactly perfectly. Yeah, like when we had our first when babies are first born, they have this very predictable nap schedule, and like you like I made a whole record like that, that I put out. It's called, "And It Came to Pass Not to Stay," and my it was a record with my brother that we put out, and that was what we were promoting when we were promoting this book, Mindful of Music. So it wasn't a Head in the Heart thing. It was Mikey and Maddie is the name of the project, and and uh, the whole album was made when our our daughter Frances was a baby, and I would be like, okay, I have 20 minutes. In that 20 minutes, I can set up a microphone and check the level. And then the baby will wake back up by the time I'm done doing that. And then I'm like, okay, then I go be present with the baby, not worry about it. And in the meantime, your brain can be thinking about like your next steps and your next like or it can be intuiting and pulling pulling songwriting material from the ether during that time. And it's kind of a symbiotic thing because you're having this relationship with your child at the same time. But then you know what you're going to do the next 20 minutes that you have, and you go in and okay, in 20 minutes I can sing through this song twice. So I'm going to go in and sing through the song twice, and then I have another break. You know what I mean? And so like for sure, it was very much like, oh, okay. I became more productive and more disciplined for sure as a result of having kids. No, there's no question about it. Yeah.
No question.
And just not to
Uh,
mention the like sense of preciousness of like having the time available when you have it. You're like, holy crap, I have to use this. It's almost become a little bit like I need to be careful about that and not be too hard on myself because when the kids are at school or when they're like, under someone else's care for a little while, I can be like, I'm having to remind myself like, oh, maybe you should just go lay in the sun for a little while, like not have to like go back into that punishing work mode all the time, you know?
Let's talk about books. Are you a genre person or are you a writer person?
Oh. I would say I'm a writer person. Well, I'll just start with that because, like, if I go back to, the formative years of like getting into writers, it would be like I'd read everything by Vonnegut. I'd read everything by Kerouac. I'd read everything by Hemingway. Read everything by Bukowski and um, 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 Salinger. You know what I mean? And like, and it'd be kind of like I do the same thing with music, where it'd be like, okay, I'm in the Beatles phase. I'm just listening to nothing but the Beatles, and so uh, more recently, it's been like, and so those are all fiction writers, but like more recently, I've been, doing the same thing with Yuval Noah Harari's series, which are just so enlightening. And a lot of the themes in those found their way onto this record, just of kind of like big global themes and how they apply to your individual life and all this stuff. Uh, and so, yeah, definitely I go by writer for sure. There's no question. Like this past winter after the election happened, I was like, okay, I'm going to take a break from politics. I'm going to take a break from everything, and I'm going to read the Lord of the Rings. And so I just like read the Lord of the Rings trilogy because I had never read it. You know what I mean? And so like, and I'm not like a guy who just reads fantasy novels at all. Like, so it was kind of such an amazing like foray into that. But I'm not like a guy who's like just like into like a fantasy genre or this or that or fiction or nonfiction. It's kind of driven by other circumstances, you know what I mean? So yeah.
That's so interesting because that's not me at all. So when I finish a book, my first thought is always, I want another voice. Which is
Wow.
why I like to read short story anthologies because you get 20 different voices. I wish I was that, but my first thought is, what else can I read by someone else? Um,
Yeah. Oh,
and
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And so I've just never been like a writer person to a certain, and not a genre person either. I just kind of, will honestly, it's not complicated. I'll just look at book review websites you know, and I'll just kind of pick what seems to be a good book that seems like a plot I want. But
Yeah.
um, do you read more than one book at a time?
Yes. Yes. That's interesting that you say that. It's totally different for me. But like what I like, and I've been lucky in my life that like um the right book will show up at the right time. And a lot of times it's the recommendation of a friend, that puts a book in my hand and it'll start me on a path. And maybe that book will reference another book that isn't by the same writer. You know what I mean? And I'll be like, "Oh, I need to read that one now because this artist or this novel talks about this other book in it, and so I'm going to make sure I go down that path." And so like it's a lot of like staying open and in tune to these other little tendrils that are out there.
Are you the type of person that when you start a book and you don't like it, do you have to finish it, or are you able to put it down and say, I'm not going to finish this?
Ah, that's a good question. Um, I am the type of person who says I have to finish it, but with the caveat that there have been some that I'm just like, oh fuck, and like I run out of steam on for sure. And life circumstances will steer you in another direction. But like, yeah, there's definitely been some periods during that same period of time where I felt like the whole writing process was self-flagellating. I think the consumption process was also pretty self-flagellating. Being, like I need to get through this, even though it wasn't for a class, there was no assignment involved. You know what I mean? It was because, yeah, like there's this sense of obligation or duty, you know what I mean? Which is, yeah.
I
But
used to be that way.
yeah.
And then once I stopped, Maddie, it was so liberating because you realized how much time you were wasting and there's other books you could be reading. I was the same way. I was like, I don't care how bad this is because I want to say I read this book. I don't want to tell
Yes.
people I didn't finish. And I
Yep.
was like, what am I doing? And
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
I It's funny because when I ask this question, some people have like, oh, I read 50 pages, 75, 100. Like they have like a preset limit of of when they get to that point, they go, do I want to continue to read another page or not? But
Uh-huh.
try it. It's very liberating.
Yeah, that's good. That's good advice. I think I've become a little bit more lenient with myself on that, like lately, especially with having kids. It's definitely been like, I've got 4 or 5 different books open at the same time.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can find all the episodes on all major streaming platforms and also at the Songwriters on Process website. That is at songwritersonpodcast.com. Pre 2020, this was not a pod. I was transcribing all of the interviews. So you can find all of them, hundreds of them, many hundreds of them on the Songwriters on Process website. You'll find both the transcribed interviews and the pod there. Take a deep dive, spend a day. These are great conversations with songwriters just about the writing process. Also, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, is out now worldwide on Hachette Books. You can find it online in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God, and it's his memoir. Again, that is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. I am biased, but that's a damn good book. My email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love suggestions, questions, comments. People always email me and tell me who they want to see on the pod next. You never know. Send me an email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. That's it for me, everyone. Have a great day.